In August of 2024, we headed north to Canada. Starting out at a border crossing in rural eastern Washington, we camped and road tripped north, eventually reaching the Yukon Territory on the Cassiar Highway, before heading south on the Alaska Highway and ending the trip crossing the border in Idaho. There's lots of lakes, wildlife, forests, and mountains in store. So please join us as we make a grand loop tour of British Columbia. Brought to you by Occidentalist Outdoors. After a smooth and uneventful border crossing, we were soon off the pavement and out into the woods. As the roads grew narrower, we knew we were on the right track to finding a spot to camp for our first night in British Columbia. Before leaving on the trip, we learned about British Columbia recreation sites. About 1,000 of these minimally developed sites are scattered across the province. Many are small campgrounds situated on remote mountain lakes. After studying the map of these sites, we knew we'd be visiting several as we road tripped across the province. Our first rec site was located at a small lake called Buck Lake. We had the whole place to ourselves when we arrived. Before long, we had the boat inflated and we headed out to the water. There he goes.
Darn it.
As day dawned, we headed on to our next destination. British Columbia Highway 24 is also known as the Fishing Highway. We hoped to find a lake to spend a few days doing just that, so we headed up the highway to find our next BC recreation site. Back into the woods we went, and before long, we had found our site. Right on the lake shore. We spent the next 3 days paddling the lake, fishing, not very much catching, and relaxing on the shore watching the sunset. Sometimes finding quiet is just what the doctor ordered. A lake deep in the woods of Canada seemed to be a good place to find it. It was time to continue north, so we hit the trail again. Yep, you guessed it, the trail led us to another BC wreck site on yet another lake in the woods. You might be picking up the theme of this trip by now. Once again, the day dawned, and we planned to keep heading north. We'd moved through the southern part of British Columbia, and we were about to set out on the Cassiar Highway that would eventually take us to the Yukon Territory. So once again, we packed up camp and pointed the truck north, in search of our next camp and our next adventure.
Good morning.
All right, we started the Cassiar Highway yesterday, and we are just outside of Stewart and Hyder. We made it a little farther up the highway than we intended. The wreck sites we were going to were occupied. So.
It's summer and it's beautiful up here. We hit some good weather, and yesterday, I have to tell you, we saw 3 bears.
Yeah, didn't really get much of a image of them, but yeah, it was nice to see 3 bears, a couple on the road and 1 in the river. And we're here specifically for that reason, at least in the Stewart and Hyder area. Tomorrow we're going to be going to the Fish Creek observation area, but today we're just here a little early, so we're going to do some looking around at some glaciers. And the scenery coming in here was absolutely stunning, huh?
Oh my gosh, it's like you're driving into a different world.
Yeah, absolutely amazing, with the mountains towering over the highway and glaciers pouring off the mountains, and it was pretty impressive. So since we were kind of in a hurry to find a camp, since our plans kind of fell through, we're coming to you from Clements Lake, by the way, which is another BC wreck site for you to stay at. Although there's not very many spots, but we found one, and that's all we needed was one. So we're gonna head out on the day, and we'll show you what we find along the way.
It's gonna be exciting.
All right, see you out on the trail. After a quick walk around the boardwalk in Stewart, we crossed out of Canada and into Hyder, Alaska. We didn't stay too long in Hyder and continued up the road and crossed back into Canada on our way to Salmon Glacier. We weren't off the pavement very long when this little black bear ambled up the road toward us. It didn't seem to care too much that we were sitting in the road, and he just continued on his way, probably off towards Fish Creek and an afternoon salmon snack. After another 20 miles or so, Salmon Glacier was coming into view. The 5th largest glacier in Canada, the Salmon Glacier is an impressive river of ice. The abundant mosquitoes nearly talked us out of staying near the glacier for the night, but not knowing when we would have another opportunity to have a front row campsite view of a glacier again, we decided to brave the bloodsuckers and found a place to enjoy the view for the rest of the day. I think we made the right decision. The next morning we were up early and hoping to see some bears, but not before one last sunrise view of the glacier. The Fish Creek Wildlife Observation Site is located just outside of Hyder, Alaska. Your $5 entry fee gets you access to the boardwalk above Fish Creek. There's obviously no guarantee that you'll see a bear or how long you'll have to wait if you do. When we visited in mid-August, the creek lived up to its name and was full of chum and pink salmon. You have a front row seat to salmon spawning in the crystal clear waters. So the dinner table was set. We just needed a hungry bear to arrive. A few hours passed. Most people that arrived early morning had moved on. And then the guest of honor arrived. A fairly large brown bear entered the area from downstream, and our patience had paid off. After catching the salmon, the bear carried it to the bank. As near as we could tell it didn't even take a bite. It sauntered back into the creek and eventually disappeared from view. After a few minutes of excitement, it was just the sound of the salmon splashing in the creek. Our time at Fish Creek had come to a close, and it was time to point the truck north again to the second half of the Cassiar Highway and the Yukon Territory. Throughout our tour of British Columbia, we'd had luck finding great spots to camp at BC recreation sites. Rec sites are scattered throughout the province and feature minimally developed campsites. We pulled into this one and felt like we were the only ones for miles around. It wasn't uncommon to have a campsite and a lake all to ourselves. The lake we were paddling on this afternoon was no exception. Well, we did have to share it with the loons. Back on the Cassiar Highway the next day, we continued our trip north. Along with the crowds, the lines on the pavement seemed to be fading away. We also left the pavement behind for a day-long side trip to Telegraph Creek. The 70-mile-long gravel road to Telegraph Creek features some dramatic vistas of the landscape and parallels portion of the Grand Canyon of the Stickeen River. You might find the road described as steep and narrow, but we found it recently graded with almost no one else traveling it. However, there are a few narrow sections with 20% grades. Before you reach the village of Telegraph Creek, the road parallels the Grand Canyon of the Stickeen. After that Grand Canyon, Telegraph Creek was a little anticlimactic. Telegraph Creek boomed in the 1860s and 1870s as a gateway to the Yukon goldfields. Located on the Stickeen River, it was the uppermost point accessible to steamers bringing supplies and miners to the area. Like most boom towns, it appears to have seen its better days. Some days the journey is the real destination. With nearly the entire day behind us and back on the Cassiar from Telegraph Creek, it was time to find a spot to spend another day or two. Our narrow road through the woods looked about our speed, and soon we had another spot on a lake that would suit us just fine. I was even able to catch a northern pike while out on a paddle. Our last day on the Cassiar Highway started out rainy, but we were still able to see enough of the mountains to enjoy them. We were also able to add a fox to our wildlife sighted list, as we spotted this little fox carrying a rabbit across the road before it quickly disappeared into the woods. You'll never guess where we are.
Just for a short time, I'm thinking, but we're still here.
Yeah.
Yukon territory.
We made it to the Yukon, just ending up the Cassiar Highway today with a short little stint in the Yukon, and then starting off on the Alaskan Highway headed south. So
lots of fun. Beautiful. Not too much wildlife today, but still, we saw a fox.
Yeah, fox carting a rabbit off, and some nice mountains going through the Cassiar there.
Yeah.
So, all right, on to our next adventure. Here we go.
See you there.
Before getting started on the Alaska Highway southbound, we made a stop at the Signpost Forest in Watson Lake, Yukon Territory. Now numbering over 100,000 signs, the Signpost Forest started as a single sign in 1942, planted there by Carl Lindley, a homesick soldier working on the Alaska Highway. It's taken off in exponential proportions since then. Having only a sticker as a sign, we found a spot and left our mark. Then we headed south out of town. Contrary to the vision you might have in your mind if you haven't been on the Alaska Highway, the road is smooth pavement with broad shoulders. And as the plentiful sign suggests, you do have to keep an eye out for the wildlife. We spent the afternoon heading south and then found a site for the night overlooking the Liard River. We were in for a treat with a front row seat for some wildlife viewing. A first for us, a wolverine ambled onto the scene. Just a couple minutes earlier, this wolverine was right on the trail of a rabbit, and although we wouldn't believe it if we hadn't seen it, the rabbit actually hid behind a river rock and lived another day. The wolverine was now hunting high and low along the riverbank for the rabbit, but he never did find the trail. Our wildlife show complete, we settled in for an encore with the sunset over the river. The view in the evening was much better than the one we woke up to. The wind had shifted and the wildfire smoke had filled the air. Down the road just a few miles, we checked into the Liard Hot Springs campground. Surrounded by 6-foot-high electrified fence, I think the intention is to keep the bears out, but we felt a little bit like we were in a cage. You take an extra risk on your walk to the hot springs as you leave the fenced area, but the soak is definitely worth it. On the road south again, from the hot springs, you get into the heart of the Canadian Rockies. We took the opportunity to get out and stretch our legs. The rivers, lakes, and mountains in this region create a spectacular setting. tucked into a spot along a turquoise blue river, the perfect spot to spend an afternoon. Many of the rivers in this region are clouded with glacial silt, but this one, littered with beaver dams, was crystal clear. Places like this just make me want to stop and take a deep breath. Back on the highway again, another wildlife first for us, caribou. It was time to stretch our legs again, but this particular hike started off a bit wet. Ironically, the trail eventually merged with a gated road. It turned out that starting out waiting wasn't necessary. Soon we were back off the 2-track, and up into the tundra we went. We were the only people in the world who decided to take this hike on this day. But we weren't alone on the trail. Before long, our destination was in view. And then we were headed back the way we came, richer for our time in the mountains. On our final stretch of the Alaska Highway, a bear with 3 cubs contemplated crossing the road, but then she changed her mind. All right, we made it to Dawson Creek. We were traveling down the Alaska Highway, so mile 0 is kind of our end for the Alaskan Highway.
Woohoo!
Kind of anticlimactic. The best part was up in the Rockies. The last 4 hours or so, it's just kind of like, let's get it over with. But
if we had a lot of gas in the truck, we'd go back and forth. Like,
yeah, we want to go do the Rockies again. That was nice. So that's the highlight of the trip between Dawson Creek and Watson Lake. I was gonna say Williams Lake, but
close.
Watson Lake. So definitely spent some time in the Rockies. That was nice. So this will wrap up our leg of this trip, and we still got quite a ways to go on the way home. Got some more adventures that are yet to be determined, but gonna have a good time traveling south from here. See you out on the trail. After finishing up the Alaska Highway, we found a camp on yet another quiet lake. We stayed a couple of days and just enjoyed some paddling time on the water. We also found ourselves on a lake with plenty of evidence of fish. These little guys weren't exactly what we were looking for, but they were a good sign. We found a lot of willing biters on this lake. Pike minnow wasn't the fish we were really after, but they still provided some good entertainment. Sometimes just having a lake all to yourselves is all you really need out of the day. We hit the road and moved south, and yes, another day, another lake to paddle. We were back in a rhythm. Drive, set up camp, paddle, repeat. It didn't get old. On this particular lake, the trout were rising to flies, which made for a pretty fun afternoon. This beaver was taking time off from dam building to enjoy a dinner of lily pads. Back on the road again. Driving south along the Canadian Rockies is like driving through a postcard. While Mud Lake definitely lives up to its name, the name doesn't give you any idea of the view you'll see when you get there. Southern BC has several inland ferries to carry you across rivers and lakes. Our first ferry on this trip has to be the smallest one, with a capacity that appeared to max out at 2 vehicles. Our second passage was across Upper Arrow Lake on a slightly larger ferry. We had a front row seat. There was no charge to ride the inland ferries in British Columbia. The views, however, are priceless. Ferry rides for the day complete, it was time to find a camp for the night. How about a lake? I'm figuring you already predicted that. But to truly leave the crowds behind, sometimes you have to navigate some rough roads first. This would end up being our last British Columbia recreation site, and as was pretty typical on our trip, we had this last site and the entire lake to ourselves for our 2-day stay. We did get some of our only rain of the trip at this last stop, but that just added some nice clouds and fog to the mountains that were towering above the lake to round out the North Woods feel here. We observed and listened to loons on every lake we camped out across British Columbia. It's a sound I'll never tire of. Our time in BC was coming to a close, and a quiet lake surrounded by mountains seemed like the way to end a perfect trip. The next morning, it was one more ferry ride across Kootenay Lake before we made our way to the border crossing and headed for home. Thanks for joining us on our grand loop tour of British Columbia. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe to the channel so we can meet again on our next adventure. Until then, we'll see you on the trail.